It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you receive expert fantasy advice for champions. With your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. Hello, NFL football fans, fantasy football owners. Welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. As always, I'm your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. I've got a great and exciting show on tap for you today. We are going to be taking a look at our first updated rankings for the NFL fantasy football season. We have 3 weeks in the books, aside from our Monday Night Football game, which is a big one between the Detroit Lions and Baltimore Ravens. But by far, this is the most exciting time for fantasy football owners outside of our fantasy football training camp and obviously doing our live drafts, when we get an opportunity to take a look at where players were ranked coming into the season, and then after the first 3 weeks of action, where players are ranking now. So let's go ahead and jump right into our quarterback ranking, starting at number 1. And the guy who was number 1 coming into the season, and that's none other than Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. Extremely hot start, ranking inside the top 5 fantasy quarterbacks the first 2 weeks of the season. At number 2 is the guy who was also at number 2. So through the first 3 weeks of the season, we have those guys pegged in exactly where they are, and that'll be Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. Has gotten off to a great start as well, putting up big numbers in 2 out of his first 3 games. Now let's go ahead and move over to quarterbacks 3 through number 5. It's going to be Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. Has played extremely well, worked his way up the ranks. He's a guy who we talked about looking at some quarterbacks who could potentially break into that top 5. He's certainly done that through the first 3 weeks of the season. And number 4, how about Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears, averaging well above 20 points per contest. Had a big performance in week 3 with 298 passing yards and scorched that Dallas Cowboys secondary for 4 TDs. And then rounding out our top 5, a guy who was also in our top 5, and that would be Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. The first 2 weeks of the season, got it done with 3 rushing touchdowns. In week 3, brought the Eagles back from a 26-7 deficit at home against the Los Angeles Rams, on his way to 33 big fantasy points in our NFL Explorer leagues. Now let's move over to the quarterbacks ranked 6 through 10. And how about at number 6? A guy who was ranked at number 6, and that would be Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. Had a huge game in week 2 at home, helped the Lions hang 52 points on that Chicago Bears defense. Goff put up 4 passing touchdowns, had 41 big points in our NFL Explorer Fantasy Football League. And then at number 7, Jayden Daniels, just outside of the top 5 where he ranked coming into the season. Missed week 3 due to a knee injury, but the first 2 weeks of the season did average more than 20 points per contest. Now, when we look at quarterbacks ranked 8 through 10, I want you guys to really pay attention as to why I have these players highlighted. We start with Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs. Has not had his full stable of weapons coming into the season. Both his top 2 wide receivers, in Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice, have been out. Rice will be returning after week 6, serving a suspension. And as for Worthy, got hurt the very first play of the NFL season in that game against the Los Angeles Chargers. Has a dislocated shoulder. We expect to see him back soon. Next, we're talking about Baker Mayfield of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Has yet to have his full array of weapons at his disposal. Coming into the season, 2 of his top 4 receivers, and Chris Godwin and Jalen McMillan, were out injured. And then, unfortunately, in week 3, his top target and wide receiver Mike Evans left out of that game with a hamstring injury. Moving over to number 10, we're talking about Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers. Purdy himself has missed the last 2 weeks with a turf toe and shoulder injury. And then when you look at his weapons that he usually has at his disposal, tight end George Kittle has missed the last 2 weeks. He's on the IR with a hamstring injury. His top receiver from last year, Brandon Ayuk, is still recovering from an ACL injury. Demarcus Robinson, a wide receiver that they brought over from the Los Angeles Rams, missed the first 3 games due to suspension. And Jawan Jennings has only played in 2 out of 3 games this season. He missed week 3 with a shoulder and ankle injury as well. So those 3 quarterbacks, I would have them ranked inside of my top 10. if they had their full cast of weapons with them. I think right now Baker Mayfield and Patrick Mahomes have still performed at a high level despite that. But those three quarterbacks, I want you to firmly keep your eyes on. And the reason I have those guys highlighted, because when they get healthy and all of their weapons are with them, I expect for them to have big second half of the seasons coming down the stretch. Let's go ahead and move over now to our quarterbacks ranked 11 through 15. We're talking about Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams, Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys, Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts, Sam Darnold of the Seattle Seahawks, Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. I think when you look at that list 11 through 15, those are going to be your next best options consistently on a weekly basis. I love what Matthew Stafford can do. He's got Puka Nacua and Devonta Adams at wide receiver. You look over at Dak Prescott. He's got CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens at wide receiver. He's got a nice tight end and Jake Ferguson. We're happy to see him getting back in the fold. How about Daniel Jones at 13? Has really climbed his way up the ladder, was ranked in our bottom tier of quarterbacks coming into the season, but he's been extremely consistent leading that Colts offense. You look at Sam Darnold, really starting to get the wheels turning over there with Seattle, working with Jackson Smith and Jigba, Cooper Kupp, and rookie Torrey Horton coming on strong for that Seattle passing game. And then Bo Nix certainly hasn't played up to par, but I think when you look at some of the corrections he can make, very fixable. And I think Sean Payton and that offense will get things rolling as the season goes on. Let's now move on to our quarterbacks ranked 16 through 20. Right now, Justin Fields is a guy who's out of the lineup with a concussion injury. But I think when he's back in the lineup, he's a guy who's certainly a dual threat quarterback. You look at Drake May of the New England Patriots performing well. Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, Jordan Love, rounding out our top 20 quarterbacks. All of those guys' play has been a little bit erratic. I think Kyler Murray and Jordan Love, and particularly those guys, not playing extremely well in terms of putting up big numbers. Savvy veteran Aaron Rodgers has 2 games this season of 2 or more touchdowns. Now when we start working our way on our last list, 21 through 30, it's got some question marks here. Tua Tagovailoa is a guy I like when it's a matchup-based play against easier defenses. When you look at 22 and 23, Carson Wentz could be a long-term or short-term quarterback. He's filling in right now for the injured J.J. McCarthy. We know that Jake Browning is going to be in the majority of the season for the injured Joe Burrow, who was the other quarterback coming into our season, ranked inside the top 5. And then when you look at the rest of these quarterbacks here, you got a couple underachievers at 29 and 30. C.J. Stroud, Michael Penix Jr. really struggling. And then guys like Geno Smith, Trevor Lawrence, Bryce Young, Russell Wilson, Cam Ward, Joe Flacco, and Spencer Rattler. Those are the type guys who on a week-to-week basis could end up being a starter. It really just depends on matchup and how those guys perform. I think Geno Smith's the perfect example of that, or where the Raiders got blown out this week at Washington, but he picked up a ton of garbage yards and performed much better than a lot of fantasy quarterbacks ranked ahead of him at 309 passing yards and 3 TDs. All right, we're going to run to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll move over to the running back position. It's the extra points.
Boys want to call one?
Sure.
You know she meant the cake, right?
Okay,
Some things are meant to be silly, but choosing Web Interactive Technologies to host your business online is like the opposite of silly.
They'll work with you and build your custom website.
And the search engine optimization? Finding your company will be... you get it.
As a business, you have to stand out. We're just pointing you in the right direction. Choose Web Interactive Technologies. Don't be silly.
Football fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. Let's go ahead now and shift our attention over to the running back position. And again, these are our first updated rankings. We have 3 weeks of NFL action in the book, so we have a real gauge and feel for how guys have performed thus far and very likely are going to continue to excel the rest of the season. Starting off with Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts has been absolutely spectacular. 2 big games back-to-back weeks at home against the Denver Broncos, sliced through the Tennessee Titans defense this past Sunday, averaging 25 points per contest to lead all fantasy football running backs. At number 2, Christian McCaffrey is back doing his thing. Good to see him back fully healthy. We know that Christian McCaffrey is a flat-out production machine when he's fully healthy. Got him ranked number 2, doing an excellent job, not only on the ground, but we know that this guy is a big-time value when you talk about catches out of the backfield. And then number 3, how about James Cook of the Buffalo Bills has worked his way up inside of the top 5 fantasy football running backs, doing a great job putting up the big numbers so far this season. Number 4, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. Number 5, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. Both of those guys ranked inside of our top 5 running backs coming into the season. Now let's go ahead and move over to running backs 6 through 10. Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Bucky Irvin, Omarion Hampton, Kyren Williams. I think the guy that really stands out in this list now is going to be number 9, Omarion Hampton of the Los Angeles Chargers. Came into the season tied into a possible committee situation with running back Najee Harris. Unfortunately, in week 3, Harris suffered a non-contact injury, torn Achilles, out for the season. That ultimately now is going to allow for Omarion Hampton to get the full workload for an explosive Chargers offense. For owners who picked him up in their draft, you have to be elated about the opportunity that the rookie has. Looked very good in week 3 against the Denver Broncos, where he was effective not only on the ground, but also getting catches out of the backfield, which is really going to give him some added value when you talk about full point PPR leagues. Now let's go ahead and move over to running backs 12 through 15. And we're talking about Javonte Williams, Devon Achane, Travis Etienne, Chuba Hubbard, and Josh Jacobs. I think when you take a look at those guys, you really have to like what you see out of Kenneth Walker III, another guy who was kind of tied into a committee. When you talk about the Seattle Seahawks sharing time with Zach Charbonnet, Charbonnet missed week 3 with a foot injury, which allowed for Walker to get the full workload. He followed up his big 100-yard rushing performance and TD game in week 2 at Pittsburgh by pumping in 2 more rushing touchdowns in the Seahawks week 3 blowout at home of the New Orleans Saints. It'll be interesting to see if he keeps a stronghold on that position. At number 12, Javonte Williams, another guy where there was uncertainty about that Dallas backfield, but he's came in, taken things over, and has been a great performer. Obviously, one of our late round and value picks through the first 3 weeks of the season. The other guy making some noise here at number 14 is Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, another guy who was tied into a potential committee situation with Tank Bigsby, but performed so well in week 1 when we talk about Travis Etienne picking up a big 143 rushing yards. The Jaguars decided to part ways with Tank Bigsby, which ultimately allowed for Travis Etienne to put a stronghold on that Jacksonville backfield. And then, of course, at number 15, you got to shout out Chuba Hubbard, regardless of the circumstance, whether Carolina is winning, whether Carolina is losing, whether it's a blowout, whether it's a close game. Chuba Hubbard finds a way to pump in the big fantasy numbers for his fantasy football owners. Now let's move over to running back 16 through 20. I think the guy that stands out here on the list, and we've got a couple of them. How about number 17, J.K. Dobbins, another running back who was tied into a potential committee situation coming into the season with rookie R.J. Harvey. If you look at what Dobbins has done through the first 3 games, He's found the end zone in every game and certainly has a firm hold on that Denver backfield. So for owners who have him, you find great comfort in. Without question, he's another one of our late round value picks. And then also, let's talk about Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Not doing a lot on the ground, but when you look at his value catching out of the backfield, that certainly makes him a top 20 fantasy play weekly at the running back position. Now let's shift over to our last board, running backs 21 through 32. Let's look at the guys that we have highlighted on this board, and we've got quite a few. Let's start off with running backs ranked 21 through 26. The first three guys that you see when we talk about Jordan Mason, Cam Skattebo, and Quinshon Judkins. You got two rookies there when you talk about Cam Skattebo and Quinshon Judkins at 22 and 23, who look like they are about set to take over their backfields. We knew it'd probably be only a matter of time before Judkins really stood out for Cleveland, got the full workload in week 3, 96 rushing yards, got his first touchdown as an NFL pro, and then Cam Skattebo. Whether it was a result of Tyrone Tracy being limited in practice this week, but I think Skattebo really made a strong statement in week 2 against the Dallas Cowboys. Showed a nice set of hands out of the backfield as well. Found 120 plus all-purpose yards and a touchdown that was big. He is obviously going to be a hot waiver wire pickup. And then when you talk about Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings, took over that Vikings backfield kind of by default. He's another guy that was somewhat in a committee. You heard those murmurs coming into the season along with veteran Aaron Jones. Well, Jones is on the IR with a hamstring injury, and Mason got off to a hot start against the sad Cincinnati Bengals defense where he racked up 20 plus points and had an outstanding day. I think those three running backs to start our list without question, if they're not already on your team, put them on as targets. They are going to be hot waiver wire pickups. Now let's look at running backs 24 through 26. Now, Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals and Ashton Jeanty of the Las Vegas Raiders. Both of those guys have concerns when it comes to picking up rushing yards. When you look at Chase Brown, that Bengals offensive line, one of the worst in the NFL, not a lot of room to run there. For Ashton Jeanty, defenses are really clogging the box and making it difficult for him to run. The reason I have those guys ranked just ahead of David Montgomery is because they still do get the full workload and have an opportunity to put in points for fantasy owners when it comes to catches out of the backfield. But David Montgomery, who is on a much better team, way more explosive offense, has his role way more defined next to running back Jahmyr Gibbs, could be a guy who could, on random weeks, score better points than all of these running backs that you see ranked ahead of him, depending on situation. Let's go ahead and round out the list. The other guys highlighted here, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. Not sure if he's in the committee with Braylon Allen, but the best numbers that we can expect from him is going to be when dual threat quarterback Justin Fields is back in the fold. And then you look at Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. He's the guy who's got a ton of value now. It's going to be another hot waiver wire pickup. Unfortunately, the Cardinals running back and starter in James Conner is going to miss the rest of the season due to an ankle injury. When we round out our list, Nick Chubb really struggling to get things going for that Houston offense. And then we still have two committees that need to be figured out when we talk about the Washington Commanders and the New England Patriots. We're going to run to another quick break. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, so don't go anywhere. fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. Let's go ahead now and shift our attention over to the wide receiver rankings and see what pass catchers are pumping in the big numbers for your team so far. At number 1, who else but the Los Angeles Rams, Puka Nacua, leading all NFL receivers in receiving yards so far this year. And this guy is proven to be a dominant number 1 receiver, continues to pump in the big numbers on a weekly basis for that Los Angeles Rams offense. At number 2, how about Jackson Smith-Njigba is doing this thing out in Seattle, started the season with back-to-back 100-yard receiving games in weeks 1 and 2. Just missed this past week in week 3, but still had 96 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. If you're like me and you couldn't get your hands on him, man, I have a ton of regret about that. This guy looks like he's going to have a huge season for the Seahawks. At number 3, it's Rome Odunze, the second-year pro from the University of Washington, has 4 receiving touchdowns and is off to an extremely hot start for that Chicago Bears offense. At number 4, we've got a rookie in the fold. We're talking about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers stud, and that is Emeka Egbuka. 3 TD receptions and had a big game, up over 90 receiving yards in week 3 at home against the New York Jets. And then we got another young guy. Good to see him getting his hands together, because that was really the only issue when we were talking about Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers, but is off to a great start as well. Has 3 receiving touchdowns in the first 3 games of the season. Shout out to fantasy football owners who were able to grab him off the waiver wire early. I think he's a guy you'll be able to put in your lineup and make up for some of these receivers we'll talk about a little later in the list who are struggling with the likes of a Marvin Harrison Jr. or Calvin Ridley early on. Let's look at receivers ranked 6 through 10. CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys had back-to-back weeks of up over 100 receiving yards in weeks 1 and 2. Unfortunately, left out of week 3's game early with an ankle injury. Let's hope it's nothing long-term. We know this guy is a flat-out stud. Number 7, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions had 3 TD catches in week 2. I think he's going to continue to be an all-star. We know why he was certainly ranked inside of our top 10. Let's move on to number 8. Zay Flowers has really become the main target for Lamar Jackson and that Baltimore Ravens offense. Back-to-back week of up over 14 fantasy football points. How about Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts? Great draft value for owners who were able to pick him up in later rounds. It's really good to see him back as a focal point of that Indianapolis offense. Has 2 receiving touchdowns, 2 strong games to his credit. I like the direction he's going. And then we've got another Charger in the fold, and that's going to be Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. The savvy vet has come back home and has a touchdown catch in each and every game so far this season. Now, I'll stop real quick and keep in mind, these are just our updated rankings through the first 3 weeks of the season. This does not mean this is where we have players ranked for the rest of the season, nor is this where we have players ranked in their individual matchups for the upcoming week. All right, let's move on to guys 11 through 20. A lot of value here. We're talking about Devonta Adams of the Los Angeles Rams, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders, Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. All of those guys have either been up over 100 yards and or have at least a couple touchdowns to start the season off. Let's focus real quick on the guys who are highlighted. Started at number 12, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Unfortunately, left out of Sunday's game with a hamstring injury. He'll get his MRI today, but by the looks and how I seen from his body language in the tunnel, you may expect for him to be out of your lineup for some time. If we look at some other players like Aaron Jones, running back for the Minnesota Vikings, George Kittle, tight end of the San Francisco 49ers, their hamstring injuries put them on the IR for a month, so certainly not a good sign. We hope a speedy return for Evans, who started off the season with 3 games of double-digit fantasy points. Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase at 13 and 14. We know those guys are 2 of the best in the business, but inconsistent quarterback play could ultimately mar their numbers. And I think we've seen that through the first 3 weeks of the season, where both of them had huge weeks in week 2, but weeks 1 and week 3, you couldn't even find their names on the stat sheet. That is something that could be problematic. Let's go ahead now and look at wide receivers ranked 20 through 30. I want to start off with the guys I've got highlighted. Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders and Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. Now, again, I like when we do our early updated rankings, because as the season wears on, a lot of these guys' names you won't see on the list as the season progresses. But through the first 3 weeks of the season, let's give these guys their credit. Trey Tucker came out, had 3 receiving TDs in week 3 at the Washington Commanders, and Wan'Dale Robinson had a huge game in week 2 for the New York Giants. So I do not expect for those guys to continue to be up near our top 20, but through the first 3 weeks of the season, let's give those guys their just due. Now when we look at the rest of this list, again, it's a 3-week sample size that we have. So you're going to have some inconsistent play due to matchups and just a variety of reasons to why these guys may not be performing at the level that we expect them. But I think as we work our way through the rest of this list, even though there may be some lesser names like a Trey Tucker, like a Wan'Dale Robinson, like a Ricky Pearsall, who may not remain through the course of the season, when we start looking at 22 on down, all of these guys are studs. All these guys have been all fantasy performers in the past, and I expect for them to start picking the pace up. And that's going to start with A.J. Brown. Let's hope that week 3, his 6 catches for 109 yards and a TD reception can really get him jump-started and have that Philadelphia Eagles offense open up some outside of being so conservative and run-orientated. Tyreek Hill, George Pickens, Drake London, Justin Jefferson, Chris Olave, Tatoria McMillan, DK Metcalf, all of those guys have a ton of value. You look at Pickens really stepping his game up as a number 2 receiver and for the Dallas Cowboys. Guys like Drake London have gotten off to a slow start, but there is most certainly a ton of potential. Hopefully quarterback Michael Penix Jr. can get it rolling. 30 through 40. Let's go ahead and take a look at Jacoby Myers, Terry McLaurin, Jawan Jennings, Brian Thomas Jr., Jameson Williams, Marvin Harrison Jr., DJ Moore, Ladd McConkey, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins, Khalil Shakur. Again, all of those guys have been inconsistent so far, but are super talented as players, and we expect for these guys to move up the rankings as the season goes on. When we round out our last list of guys, let's look at a couple people we have highlighted in Kansas City. It's going to kind of be a revolving door until they can get back fully healthy, but when they're at their pinnacle, we know that Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice are going to be the main guys there. And then for the Denver Broncos, for the New England Patriots, we're still looking for some number 2 receivers to kind of fill in and be consistent plays. A couple guys letting us down right now, more than anybody, is going to be Calvin Ridley. We thought that he could be a guy who could be a top 20 fantasy performer, has really been missing in action so far. And then those Buffalo Bills receivers, when you talk about Khalil Shakur and Keon Coleman, you could see their production fluctuate on a week-to-week basis in that high-powered Buffalo offense, which makes them hard to trust. All right, that is going to wrap up our show for today. Please make sure to check out our social media pages, to check out our tight end rankings, and also to stay up with me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I drop tons of great content and information all over the internet. It's going to wrap up today's show. You know what it is, the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. I'll see you guys next week. Let's go.